Imagine holding in your hands a map that promises to show you the world, only to realize it's filled with deliberate lies, monsters lurking in uncharted waters, phantom islands drawn to lure explorers to their doom, and holy cities placed at the center of everything not for truth, but for control. This wasn't the stuff of fantasy. For centuries, maps were among the most powerful instruments of deception ever created, crafted not to guide, but to mislead, to dominate, and to shape reality itself. In an age where information was scarce and authority was everything, cartography became a silent battlefield for hearts, minds, and empires. We often think of maps as neutral scientific documents meant to represent the world as it is. But step back into the Middle Ages and you enter an era where geography was woven with threads of faith, ambition, and outright trickery. Kings, popes, and merchants didn't just commission maps, they weaponized them. A coastline might be shifted to hide a trade route. A continent might be left off entirely to stoke fear or curiosity. Legends of paradise or hell were inked onto parchment to justify crusades, conquests, and colonies. These weren't mistakes, they were features, not bugs, strategic layers of misdirection designed to control what people believed was possible, what they feared was out there, and what they thought was rightfully theirs. Today, we're going to explore 22 of these astonishing medieval maps that lied on purpose. Together, we'll uncover how they were used to fuel religious fervor, justify invasion, monopolize wealth, and even rewrite history. From the Hereford Mapa Mundi, a theological masterpiece that placed Jerusalem at the center of the world, to the Catalan Atlas, which blended Marco Polo's travels with pure myth to attract investors and explorers. Each of these maps tells a story not just of places, but of power. You'll see how cartographers, often working under the directive of the most powerful figures of their time, turned blank spaces on the map into canvases for manipulation, and how those deceptions echo even into our modern understanding of borders, identity, and truth. This is a journey into the shadows of history where geography becomes propaganda, and a simple line on a page can change the course of civilizations. Let's begin. To truly grasp why these maps were designed to deceive, we need to step into the medieval mind. This was a world where the spiritual and the physical were inextricably linked, a place defined more by faith and authority than by empirical observation. The very fabric of reality was understood through a lens of divine order, and the cartographers of the age were not merely surveyors. They were theologians, storytellers, and political operatives wielding ink and vellum. Their primary purpose was not to chart a sailor's course with perfect precision, but to illustrate a grand, cosmic narrative, one that placed humanity, and specifically Christendom, at the heart of God's creation. This worldview found its perfect expression in the TO map, a simple yet profound model that dominated for centuries. Imagine a circle representing the known world, divided by a T-shaped body of water. The vertical stem of the T is the Mediterranean Sea, separating Europe on the left from Africa on the right. The horizontal bar represents both the Don River and the Nile, dividing those continents from the vast landmass of Asia at the top. And at the very center of it all, you would always find Jerusalem. This wasn't a geographical statement based on travel times or coordinates. It was a theological one. The city was considered the spiritual navel of the world, the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, and centering it on a map was an act of devotion that reinforced the Church's doctrine. These maps were less about getting from one port to another and more about understanding one's place in a universe orchestrated by divine will. Yet, alongside these symbolic masterpieces existed a different, more pragmatic tradition, the Portolan chart. Used by Mediterranean mariners, these charts were marvels of practical navigation, featuring remarkably accurate coastlines dotted with a web of room lines that helped sailors plot courses between ports. They were born from experience and observation, the hard-won knowledge of traders and explorers. But here lies the fascinating contradiction. Even these functional tools were often subject to manipulation. A cartographer in the employ of a wealthy trading republic like Venice or Genoa might deliberately alter a coastline or omit a strategically vital island to give his patrons a commercial or military advantage over rivals. Accuracy was a commodity to be hoarded and selectively distributed, showing that even the most scientific maps of the era could be laced with intentional deceit. The people behind these maps were rarely independent artists. They were craftsmen working under the direct patronage of the most powerful institutions of their time. A monk in a scriptorium, illuminated only by candlelight, would be guided by his abbot to emphasize certain biblical sites and omit others, crafting a map that served as a visual sermon for an illiterate congregation. At a royal court, a cartographer would answer to a king or queen, subtly exaggerating the borders of their realm or depicting neighboring lands as smaller or more barren to legitimize expansionist ambitions. The map was a direct reflection of the patron's desires, a tool to spread ideology, justify territorial claims, and project power onto parchment. In this environment, truth was a secondary concern to utility. A map's value was measured not by its accuracy, but by its effectiveness in serving the goals of faith and crown. This fundamental tension between representing the world and reshaping it for a purpose is the key that unlocks the secrets of every deceptive map we are about to explore. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most spectacular and ambitious examples of this craft, a map that is less a chart of the earth and more a diagram of the medieval soul. The Hereford Mapa Mundi is a breathtaking artifact, a sprawling vellum canvas over 5 feet across that demands to be read not with a compass but with a prayer book. Created around the year 1300 in Hereford, England, its sheer size tells you immediately that this was no practical tool for a traveler. You couldn't fold this up and take it on a journey. Its journey was a spiritual one, meant to be displayed in a cathedral and used to instruct the faithful, to provide a single, sweeping glance at God's creation and humanity's place within it. At first glance, the map presents a familiar TO structure, but it is so densely populated with imagery and text that it becomes a visual encyclopedia of everything a medieval Christian was meant to believe, fear, and aspire to. And right at the very center, the literal heart of this drawn world, sits the city of Jerusalem. This central placement is the map's most fundamental and powerful lie. Geographically, Jerusalem is not the center of anything, but theologically, it was everything. By anchoring the entire known universe to this one point, the map's creators were making a profound statement. All of history, all of geography, all of human existence radiates from and revolves around the site of Christ's sacrifice. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a cartographic declaration of absolute truth, reinforcing the Church's authority as the sole interpreter of that truth. But the Mapa Mundi's deception extends far beyond just centering Jerusalem. It actively reshapes the world to fit a moral hierarchy. Paradise, the Garden of Eden, is placed at the very top of the map, located in the distant east. Helmuth, the gaping jaw of a monstrous beast swallowing damned souls, is vividly illustrated at the bottom. This vertical axis creates a powerful spiritual geography. Up is good, down is evil, and humanity exists somewhere in between, on a journey from one to the other. The physical accuracy of continents is completely secondary to this spiritual narrative. The Holy Land itself is drawn massively out of proportion, a giant bullseye around Jerusalem, while places like Britain and Scandinavia are shrunk and pushed to the very fringes, visually minimizing their importance in the grand divine plan. Then there are the inhabitants of these distant, poorly understood lands. The edges of the map, the areas beyond Christian control and knowledge, are teeming with some of the most fantastical and terrifying creatures ever put to parchment. This is where you find the Blemii, a race of headless men with their faces embedded in their chests. You see the Cyopods, men with a single gigantic foot they could use to shade themselves from the sun. There are cannibals, dog-headed people called cynosphali, and other beings straight out of legend and classical texts. This was not mere whimsy or a lack of better information. This was a deliberate strategy. By populating the unknown with monsters, the map effectively dehumanized foreign cultures and non-Christian peoples. It defined the world in stark terms. Here at the center is order, salvation, and civilization. Out there on the edges is chaos, barbarism, and damnation. This visual rhetoric served a crucial political purpose. It justified the ongoing Crusades and the concept of holy war. If those distant lands were filled with monstrous subhumans, then conquering them wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of purification, a sacred duty to expand the realm of God and save monstrous souls in the process. The Hereford Mapa Mundi is a masterpiece not of geography but of ideological storytelling, using the visual language of a map to preach a sermon of power, fear, and divine right. While the Hereford Mapa Mundi is a grand and public declaration of faith, another map from the same era wielded its influence in a far more intimate, yet equally powerful way. The Psalter World Map, so named because it was found tucked into the pages of a psalm book, is a small, unassuming diagram, barely larger than a modern dinner plate. Its size, however, belies its immense ideological force. Created in England around the 1260s, this was not a map for a cathedral wall but for private devotion, a personal and portable guide to a universe entirely governed by divine will. It takes the TO model and distills it to its most potent essence, stripping away any detail that doesn't serve its singular purpose, to show a believer that every inch of the world, from its creation to its potential end, is under the watchful eye of Christ. The most immediate and striking feature is the figure of Christ himself, who looms large outside the circular frame of the world, his hands gently cradling the creation below. This isn't a subtle suggestion, it's a direct visual statement of ownership and dominion. The world is not just a physical place but a possession, a divine project overseen by its creator. Within the circle, the geography is almost brutally simplified. The three continents are clearly labeled, but their shapes are abstract, mere vehicles for the map's true content, sacred history. At the top, in the east, sits the Garden of Eden, illustrated not as a mere location but as a vibrant scene featuring Adam and Eve at the moment of the temptation, with the serpent coiled around the tree of knowledge. This single image connects the very beginning of human time to the physical structure of the earth, making theology inseparable from geography. This is where the map's genius for strategic omission becomes clear. Vast and well-known regions like Scandinavia are simply missing. Large portions of Africa are truncated or ignored. This was not a result of the mapmaker's ignorance. By the 13th century, knowledge of these areas was certainly more detailed than this map lets on. The omissions were a deliberate act of censorship. By removing the secular and the unfamiliar, the map forces the viewer's attention inward toward the core of the Christian story. There is no room for the monstrous races of the Hereford map because there is no conceptual space for them. the entire world has been curated to include only what is biblically significant. The Red Sea is painted a brilliant vermilion, not for accuracy, but to keep the story of Moses' miracle vividly alive in the viewer's mind. The city of Jerusalem is, of course, prominently placed at the very center, acting as the anchor for this entire manufactured reality. The Psalter map was a tool for indoctrination, a compact and efficient machine for reinforcing ideology. For a medieval believer poring over its images by candlelight, it presented a complete and closed system. There were no blank spaces to spark curiosity about unknown cultures, no accurate coastlines to inspire trade or exploration. There was only the path of salvation, charted from Eden to Jerusalem under the supervision of Christ. It created a safe, manageable, and ideologically pure worldview, effectively building walls around the faithful not with stone, but with ink. It taught that to understand the world, one did not need to travel it or study its diversity. One only needed to understand the Scripture as interpreted by the Church. This was perhaps the most subtle and insidious deception of all, presenting a radically edited version of reality, not as an opinion or a perspective, but as the only reality that truly mattered. If the Psalter map used omission to create a closed, pious world, and the Hereford Mapa Mundi used monsters to define the edges of Christendom, then the Catalan Atlas represents a breathtaking leap into a new kind of cartographic power, one fueled by commerce, curiosity, and a cunning blend of fact and fantasy. Created in 1375 by the master cartographer Abraham Cresques of Majorca, this was not a map for prayer but for profit. Commissioned by the King of Aragon as a gift for the young French prince, this magnificent work was designed to do one thing above all else: proclaim the unmatched knowledge, wealth, and global reach of the Aragonese crown. It was a piece of state propaganda, but of the most sophisticated and seductive kind, a map that whispered promises of unimaginable riches to anyone brave or savvy enough to listen. Unlike the inward-looking religious maps, the Catalan Atlas eagerly embraces the entire known world, stretching from the Atlantic coasts of Spain and Ireland all the way to the distant court of the Great Khan in China. Its accuracy in certain areas is nothing short of revolutionary. It incorporates the latest first-hand accounts from travelers and merchants, most notably the detailed descriptions from Marco Polo's journey decades earlier. The Silk Road is painstakingly traced, major cities are placed with newfound precision, and the depiction of North Africa is remarkably detailed, reflecting the close commercial ties between Majorcan traders and the continent. For a merchant prince or an ambitious navigator, this was an invaluable tool, a visual database of the world's most lucrative trade networks. It presented a vision of the earth that was connected, traversable, and brimming with opportunity. But Cresques was a master of more than just geography. He was a master of psychology. Woven seamlessly into this framework of hard-won fact are elaborate and irresistible fictions placed with strategic intent. The most famous of these is the magnificent, sprawling depiction of Mansa Musa, the legendary emperor of Mali, sitting enthroned in the heart of Africa. He holds a massive golden orb, a direct reference to his famous pilgrimage to Mecca decades earlier, where he distributed so much gold that he allegedly caused inflation across Egypt for a decade. This image was a powerful magnet for the eyes and the ambitions of any European ruler, a literal king of a land overflowing with gold, just waiting to be contacted, traded with, or conquered. Even more potent was the persistent inclusion of the kingdom of Prester John. This mythical Christian patriarch was said to rule a vast, powerful, and fabulously wealthy empire somewhere in the depths of either Africa or Asia, a beacon of hope and a potential ally for a Europe that felt besieged by Islamic powers. By placing Prester John on the map, Cresques wasn't making a childish error. He was selling a dream. He was telling European powers that beyond the Islamic world lay a powerful Christian friend who could, if they could only find him, help them crush their enemies and open up the entire world to trade and conversion. This fictional ally made the terrifying prospect of sailing into unknown waters seem not just less dangerous, but like a sacred and strategic necessity. This is the true genius and deception of the Catalan Atlas. It uses its very accuracy in well-charted areas to lend credibility to its most audacious fantasies. The precise coastline of the Mediterranean makes the golden rivers of Africa seem plausible. The realistic trade routes to Asia make the search for Prester John feel like a logical next step. It was this perfect cocktail of truth and legend that made it so effective. It gave practical sailors the information they needed to travel known routes, while simultaneously giving kings and investors the ideological and financial motivation to fund voyages into the unknown. The map didn't just reflect reality, it actively worked to create a new one, fueling the engines of exploration, colonialism, and economic expansion that would define the coming centuries. It proved that the most powerful lie is often the one carefully stitched between established truths. Yet the most insidious deceptions are often the ones cloaked in the guise of truth, and no map better exemplifies this than the infamous Vinland map. While the maps we've explored so far were products of their medieval time, this particular document is a modern fake, a 20th century creation that perfectly weaponized the themes of medieval deception for a contemporary audience. Its story begins in 1957, when a mysterious, ancient-looking map surfaced, bound within an authentic medieval manuscript. The map depicted the world in a style reminiscent of the 15th century, but with one astonishing, headline-grabbing addition: a large, clearly drawn island in the far west, labeled in Latin as Vinlandia Insula. According to the map's text, this land had been discovered by Norse explorers in the 11th century. If genuine, this was nothing short of a historical bombshell, irrefutable cartographic proof that Vikings had reached North America long before Christopher Columbus's famous voyage in 1492. The map's allure was immediate and powerful. It tapped directly into potent nationalist and cultural narratives. For Scandinavian countries, it was a point of immense pride, concrete evidence of their Viking ancestors' unparalleled seafaring prowess. For others, it was a tool to dismantle the traditional Columbus-centric narrative of discovery, rewriting the history of the Americas. The map didn't just depict land, it depicted a new origin story, and that story was incredibly seductive. It was acquired by Yale University amidst great fanfare and published to the world in 1965, instantly becoming one of the most famous and controversial maps in history. For a few years, it was celebrated as a priceless relic, a medieval masterpiece that had shifted the tectonic plates of historical understanding. But the cracks in this carefully constructed fantasy began to show under the relentless scrutiny of scientific analysis. The first and most damning evidence came from the ink. Medieval ink was typically iron gall, made from oak galls and iron salts, which corrodes the parchment over centuries, leaving a distinctive halo effect around the line. The ink on the Vinland map showed no such corrosion. Furthermore, advanced spectroscopic analysis in the 1970s and later in the 2000s revealed the presence of anatase, a specific crystalline form of titanium dioxide. This synthetic pigment was not commercially produced or available until the 1920s, conclusively proving the ink was modern. The forger had used a clever, period-appropriate recipe for the ink's color, but its chemical composition was a glaring anachronism, a silent scream of fraud from the 20th century. The deception extended beyond just the materials. The map itself was a pastiche, a clever collage of geographical features lifted from genuine sources. The Old World portion was a direct copy of a 15th century map, but the rendering of Greenland was a dead giveaway. It was drawn with a surprisingly accurate modern coastline, a shape that would have been completely unknown to any medieval cartographer. The forger, in an attempt to make the map more believable, had inadvertently given it away by knowing too much. They had fallen into the same trap as the medieval mapmakers we've discussed, but for a different reason, where the creators of the Hereford Mapa Mundi intentionally distorted geography to serve faith. The creator of the Vinland map unintentionally revealed modern knowledge in the pursuit of perceived medieval authenticity. Despite being definitively exposed as a forgery, the Vinland map's legacy is profoundly important to our story. It demonstrates that the motives behind deceptive cartography, national pride, the desire to legitimize claims, the rewriting of history for prestige and power, are not confined to the Middle Ages. The forger understood the immense power a simple piece of parchment could hold. They knew that a map, with its aura of scientific authority, could be used to bend history to a specific will, to make a contested claim feel like settled fact. It is a perfect modern echo of the medieval impulse, proving that a line on a map is never just a line. It is an argument, a declaration, and sometimes a very well-crafted lie. Its enduring fame, even in disgrace, shows us that our fascination with maps that lie is as strong today as it was 800 years ago, a testament to their enduring power to shape what we believe is true. While the Vinland map was a modern forgery trading on medieval themes, the very real and immensely valuable Cantino Planisphere represents the ultimate expression of state-sanctioned cartographic espionage. Imagine the scene: Lisbon, 1502. The Portuguese court is buzzing with the fever of discovery. Vasco da Gama has just returned from his historic voyage to India, proving a sea route to the spice-rich East exists, and Pedro Alves Cabral has stumbled upon the coast of Brazil, claiming it for the Portuguese crown. The knowledge held in the king's possession is more valuable than any chest of gold. It is the key to a global empire, and in the shadows, an Italian agent named Alberto Cantino is operating undercover, his mission to steal it. What he smuggled out of Portugal and into the hands of his patron, the Duke of Ferrara, was not just a map. It was a leak of the highest order, a piece of intellectual property so sensitive it could shift the balance of power in Europe. The Cantino Planisphere is breathtakingly beautiful, a vibrant canvas of blue seas and golden landmasses, but its true value lay in its shocking accuracy. For the first time, a map depicted the radical new geography that Portuguese navigators had painstakingly and secretly charted. The coast of Brazil is clearly drawn, labeled Vera Cruz, a tangible claim in the New World. Most revolutionary is its depiction of Africa. Previous maps showed the continent as a vague, impassable landmass blocking the way south. The Cantino Planisphere, however, charts its entire outline with stunning precision, proving it could be circumnavigated. It shows the route to India around the Cape of Good Hope, plotting the winds and currents with a clarity that would make any European monarch's heart race. This was the Google Maps of the age of discovery, a visual testament to Portugal's sudden and overwhelming advantage in the race for global riches. But here's the brilliant deception woven into its very fibers. While the map is remarkably accurate in showing where these lands are, it is deliberately and strategically silent on how to safely reach them. This is the cartographic equivalent of showing someone a vault overflowing with treasure, but withholding the combination to the lock. The map omits crucial navigational details that were considered crown secrets: the precise patterns of the trade winds, the locations of safe anchorages, the hidden reefs that could tear a ship apart, and the best places to take on fresh water. A rival Spanish or Genoese captain could look at the Cantino Planisphere and know where to aim his ship, but without those missing details, his journey would be infinitely more dangerous, his chances of success drastically lower. The Portuguese had mastered the art of selective truth, giving away just enough information to reveal their achievements and intimidate rivals, while holding back the essential data that would allow anyone to replicate their success. This act of espionage and its resulting map perfectly encapsulate a seismic shift in how geographic knowledge was viewed. It was no longer just a scholarly pursuit or a tool for spiritual instruction. It had become a state secret, a form of intellectual capital to be guarded as fiercely as any fort or fleet. The Casa da India, the Portuguese government agency controlling navigation, enforced a policy of secrecy so strict that leaking a map like this was considered treason, punishable by death. They understood that in this new era, knowledge wasn't just power, it was profit. By controlling the only accurate charts of the route to the Spice Islands, Portugal could enforce a monopoly, dictating prices to all of Europe and funding an empire. The Cantino Planisphere is the ultimate proof that in the high-stakes game of global domination, the most potent lies on a map are often the truths that are deliberately left out. Yet while kings and merchants were sponsoring espionage to steal real maps, other cartographers were busy inventing places that never existed, proving that a powerful enough fantasy could be just as profitable as any stolen secret. This brings us to one of the most persistent and alluring cartographic ghosts of the North Atlantic, the island of Brassal. Unlike the strategic omissions of the Cantino Planisphere, Brassal was a complete and total fabrication, a pure product of the mapmaker's imagination that nonetheless found a permanent home on nautical charts for over 3 centuries. Its story is a masterclass in how a simple lie, drawn on a piece of parchment, could ignite the ambitions of nations and empty the coffers of investors, all in pursuit of a land that was nothing more than ink and wishful thinking. The legend described Brassal as a circular island, often divided by a wide river or central channel, lying somewhere in the misty waters to the west of Ireland. Its name likely derived from the old Gaelic word Brassal, meaning high king or wealth, perfectly captured its promise. It was said to be a place of immense and effortless wealth, where the very sands glittered with gold and the trees bore precious gems instead of fruit. For a European world hungry for new sources of revenue, especially after the economic upheavals of the Black Death, this was a siren's call impossible to ignore. The island first began appearing on Catalan charts in the early 14th century, most notably on the work of the Majorcan cartographer Angelino Dulcet in 1339. With a few confident strokes of his pen, he transformed a Celtic folktale into a tangible destination, a place that could and should be sought out by any enterprising captain. This act of inclusion was far from a naive mistake. Dulcet and the many cartographers who copied him for generations were highly skilled professionals working for commercial clients. They understood the market. A map that showed only known, well-traveled routes was useful, but a map that also promised a new, undiscovered El Dorado just over the horizon was infinitely more valuable. It was a sales pitch disguised as geography. By placing Brassal on a chart, a mapmaker wasn't just documenting the world, he was advertising an opportunity. He was creating a product that would be eagerly purchased by ship owners, merchants, and noble patrons looking for an edge in the next great venture. The map became a prospectus for exploration, and the Phantom Island was its most exciting initial public offering. The real-world consequences of this cartographic fiction were both costly and profound. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, numerous expeditions set sail from the ports of Bristol and Galway with the explicit purpose of finding Brassal. These were not joyrides, they were serious, well-funded missions that represented a significant investment of time, money, and human effort. In 1480, John J.J.R. sailed from Bristol in a ship called the Trinity on one such fruitless quest. These voyages, while failing in their primary objective, had an unintended side effect. In diligently crisscrossing the empty Atlantic in search of an illusion, these captains were actively exploring and charting the very real waters of the North Atlantic. Their failure to find Brassal gradually helped define the actual boundaries of the ocean, proving what wasn't there. This relentless pursuit of a myth ultimately contributed to a more accurate understanding of the geography of the region, a classic case of a lie inadvertently paving the way for truth. The most fascinating aspect of Brassal's story is its stubborn longevity. Even as maps of the world became increasingly accurate in the 16th century, with the Americas firmly established as a new continent, Brassal refused to disappear. Renowned cartographers like Gerardus Mercator and Abraham Ortelius continued to include it on their influential world maps, often shifting its location slightly further west into the ocean, as if to keep it just out of reach of disproving voyages. This persistence reveals a crucial truth about the psychology of the era. The island had transcended its origins as a mere folktale. It had become an article of faith for the exploration community. To remove it from the map would have been to admit that generations of sailors and investors had been chasing a fantasy, and to close the door on a dream that had motivated so much endeavor. The lie had become too useful, too embedded in the economic and exploratory mindset to be easily discarded. It finally took the exhaustive and precise surveys of the British Admiralty in the 19th century to officially erase Brassal from the charts, but its spectral presence had already helped write a very real chapter in the history of Atlantic exploration, proving that a map's greatest power sometimes lies not in what it reveals, but in what it compels us to go and find for ourselves. While the Catalan atlas blended fact and fiction to fuel commerce, and the Cantino Planisphere used omission for espionage, another category of map wielded a far more visceral and terrifying kind of power. These maps didn't just hide truths or promise riches, they actively weaponized the unknown, transforming blank spaces on the parchment into a theater of nightmares designed to provoke a very specific emotional response, pure, unadulterated dread. The most spectacular and chilling example of this practice was the Ebstorf world map, a colossal and breathtakingly ambitious creation that took the very concept of a map and turned it into a theological and political manifesto of staggering scale and symbolism. Tragically, the original Ebstorf map was destroyed in an Allied bombing raid on Hanover in 1943, a devastating loss to our cultural heritage. But thanks to meticulous photographs and detailed copies made before its destruction, we have an incredibly clear picture of what it contained, and it is every bit as astonishing as its reputation suggests. Created around the year 1230 by the monks of the Ebstorf Benedictine convent in northern Germany, this was not merely a map, it was the largest known medieval map of the world, a sprawling masterpiece on 30 goatskins sewn together, measuring over 12 feet across. Its sheer size was a statement in itself, meant to overwhelm the viewer, to convey the immensity of God's creation and the all-encompassing authority of the church that interpreted it. But the Ebstorf map's most radical and powerful deception was its central metaphor. It didn't just show the world, it depicted the world as the literal body of Jesus Christ. The map was oriented with east at the top, where the head of Christ would be, his golden halo often blending with the circular frame of the world. His hands reached out to the north and south, and his feet were placed at the bottom in the west. And at the very center of the map, positioned at the navel of this divine body, was the city of Jerusalem. This was the ultimate act of cartographic propaganda, a visual doctrine that claimed the entire physical planet was not just governed by God, but was physically inseparable from the body of his Son. Every mountain, every river, every city existed within this sacred anatomy, making the Church's dominion over it seem not just political, but a natural, biological fact. To question the map was to question the very body of Christ. This framework of divine ownership then gave the mapmakers license to fill the world with a very specific cast of characters. While the Holy Land and Europe were depicted with cities and biblical scenes, the margins of the map, the parts of Christ's body representing the unknown, were crawling with some of the most grotesque and terrifying imagery ever committed to parchment. This is where the map's true purpose as an instrument of fear and control becomes horrifyingly clear. In the south, in Africa, you would find the Blemii, a race of headless men with their faces embedded in their chests, staring blankly outward. Further east were the Cyapods or monopods, men with a single, gigantic foot they could use to hop at great speed or to shade themselves from the sun like a living umbrella. There were cannibals depicted feasting on human limbs, and the cynosphali, men with the heads of dogs who were said to bark to communicate. To a modern eye, these illustrations might seem like quaint superstition or the fanciful doodles of ignorant monks. Nothing could be further from the truth. Every one of these creatures was placed on the map with deliberate and calculated intent. They were not included because the monks believed they were real in a literal sense, though some certainly did. They were included because they served a crucial ideological function. By populating the farthest reaches of Asia and Africa with these monstrous races, the map was performing an act of cartographic dehumanization. It was drawing a clear, visual line between us and them. Inside the heart of Christ's body was Christendom, orderly, civilized, and saved. Outside, on the edges of his hands and feet, was chaos, barbarism, and damnation. These monstrous beings were symbolic stand-ins for all non-Christian peoples, a way to visually argue that those who lived beyond the cross were not fully human, but subhuman aberrations. This powerful visual rhetoric had a very practical and bloody purpose: to justify the ongoing Crusades in the Holy Land and the Northern Crusades happening much closer to home for the German monks who made this map. By portraying the pagan world as inherently monstrous and threatening, the map made violence against it seem not like aggression, but like a necessary act of defense, purification, and even salvation. If your enemy is a dog-headed cannibal, then launching a holy war against him is a moral duty. The map was a call to action, a piece of propaganda designed to bolster support for military campaigns, encourage donations to the crusading orders, and legitimize the conquest and forced conversion of pagan lands in the Baltic region. It turned geography into a moral battleground where every new territory conquered was not just land won, but a part of Christ's body cleansed of monstrous impurities. The Ebstorf map is perhaps the ultimate example of how cartography can be used not to illuminate the world, but to demonize it, creating a geography of fear that makes conquest feel like a sacred obligation. While the Ebstorf map used monstrous imagery to inspire holy dread, the sailors and merchants who actually braved the Mediterranean needed something far more practical to survive. They turned to a revolutionary and closely guarded tool that represented the absolute cutting edge of navigational science, the Portolan chart, emerging in the 13th century, primarily from the powerhouse maritime republics of Italy and the cartographic schools of Majorca. These charts were a world apart from the theological diagrams of the monasteries. Drawn on durable vellum and crisscrossed with a spider web of lines radiating from compass roses, they were functional, detailed, and in the hands of a skilled pilot, the difference between a profitable voyage and a watery grave. Their primary innovation was their radical accuracy for coastal navigation. For the first time, a captain could look at a chart and see the true, recognizable shape of a coastline, with headlands, bays, and river mouths plotted with a precision that would astonish anyone used to the abstract shapes of a TO map. This was geography based on direct experience, on the logged courses and soundings of thousands of voyages, compiled into a single, powerful image of the sea. This stunning accuracy, however, was a carefully curated performance. It was a truth offered only to a select few and deliberately denied to others. The very states and cartographers who produced these marvels, Venice, Genoa, Portugal, understood that geographic knowledge was a form of capital, perhaps the most valuable commodity in an age of burgeoning global trade. A chart that accurately showed the precise depth of a harbor in Alexandria or the safest approach to the Black Sea could save a merchant fleet and secure a fortune in spices or silk. That same information in the hands of a rival could break a monopoly and collapse an entire economy. Consequently, the creators of Portolan charts became masters of a new kind of cartographic deceit, not the addition of monsters or phantoms, but the strategic and deliberate insertion of subtle, devastating errors. A Venetian chartmaker, for instance, might slightly misplace a crucial freshwater-bearing island in the Aegean Sea. To a Venetian captain who had the corrected, secret version of the chart or the knowledge passed down orally from his captain, this was a minor irritant. But to a Genos rival relying on a stolen or copied chart, that error could mean missing the only place to resupply water for weeks, potentially dooming the crew to thirst or forcing a disastrous change of course. Similarly, the depth soundings for a hidden cove perfect for clandestine repairs might be deliberately understated on a common chart, scaring away unfamiliar ships while signaling to initiated local sailors that the cove was in fact deep and safe. The most prized charts were those owned by the state or powerful trading families, often annotated over generations with handwritten corrections and secret symbols, a whispered layer of truth over a printed lie, creating a two-tiered system of knowledge where power dictated perception. This practice transformed the Portolan chart from a mere tool into an active instrument of economic warfare. It was a way to wage war without firing a cannon, to protect national interests with a quill and inkpot. By controlling the flow of accurate information, a maritime power could effectively mine the sea lanes, creating hidden obstacles for their competitors while smoothing the way for their own vessels. This ensured that the immense risks and rewards of long-distance trade remained in the hands of a privileged few. The chart's beautiful, precise coastlines were a lure, a demonstration of the cartographer's skill that lent credibility to the entire document, making the hidden falsehoods all the more potent and difficult to detect. This brilliant duality, meticulous truth in the service of a central lie, secured maritime dominance for generations and established a principle that still governs sensitive information today, that the most effective deception often lies in knowing what to leave out and where to quietly, confidently draw a line in the wrong place. If the Portolan charts weaponized secrecy for profit and the Ebstorf map weaponized monsters for holy war, then another class of medieval map employed a far more subtle and ultimately more insidious form of deception. These maps didn't just alter coastlines or invent creatures. They claimed to reveal the fundamental, scientific laws governing the entire planet, using the language of reason and classical philosophy to create a framework for prejudice that would echo for centuries. These were the zonal maps, and their elegant, logical divisions of the world provided a pseudo-scientific justification for racism and colonialism that theological maps could never achieve on their own. Based on the work of ancient Roman scholars like Macrobius, who himself was interpreting even older Greek ideas, these maps presented a vision of the Earth that was beautifully symmetrical and terrifyingly hierarchical. They sliced the world into 5 horizontal parallel bands. At the top and bottom were the 2 frigid zones, believed to be permanently frozen and utterly uninhabitable wastelands of ice. At the very center of the globe was the torrid zone, a blistering equatorial belt that classical theory stated was so scorchingly hot from the constant, overhead sun that it would instantly boil the oceans and set the very air on fire, making life there impossible. This left only the 2 temperate zones nestled between the extremes as the only areas fit for human civilization. For a European audience, this created a powerful and immediate mental geography. Their own northern temperate zone was the sole cradle of true culture and advancement, a sliver of habitability surrounded by a world of hostile, impossible environments. This abstract theory became a potent tool for prejudice when it was translated onto parchment by medieval cartographers. They took this climatic model and populated it with a very specific and damaging set of assumptions. The known world, Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia, was neatly placed within the northern temperate zone, but the southern temperate zone, cut off by the impassable fiery barrier of the equator, was a vast unknown. And on zonal maps, the unknown was never left blank. It was filled with implication. This mysterious southern land, often labeled Terra Australis Incognita long before the term was used for a continent, was frequently depicted not as a mirror of Europe, but as a land of monstrous inversions. Some maps hinted that if people did live there, their fate would be opposite to ours, a concept that subtly dehumanized them. The most pernicious idea, however, was the theory of environmental determinism that grew from this model. It proposed that the extreme heat of the torrid zone didn't just make the land uninhabitable, it permanently deformed the people who lived on its edges. This wasn't just about climate, it was about character. The intense sun, it was argued, baked the intellect out of people, leaving them indolent, simple, and incapable of complex governance or advanced civilization. Their skin, darkened by the same relentless sun, became an outward, visible marker of this supposed internal deficiency. This cartographic lie provided the intellectual foundation for centuries of exploitation. When European explorers finally did breach the equator and sail into the southern hemisphere, they did not find a world on fire. They found thriving, complex societies in Africa, the Americas, and eventually Australia. But instead of discarding the flawed zonal theory, they simply adapted its prejudice to fit the new reality. The theory of environmental determinism was twisted to explain why these newly encountered peoples were different. Their cultures, their physical appearance, their very humanity was now framed not as diversity, but as a form of deviation from the European norm, a direct result of living in a less hospitable climate. The zonal map's clean, scientific-looking divisions had done their job perfectly. They had created a hierarchy of humanity that placed the European at the top, not through brute force or religious decree, but through the seemingly irrefutable logic of natural philosophy. It made racial superiority feel like a law of nature, as immutable and predictable as the changing of the seasons. This wasn't just an academic exercise, it was a license for conquest. By defining vast swaths of the world and their inhabitants as other, as less civilized and less human, these maps provided the moral and intellectual cover for the slave trade, for colonization, and for the violent subjugation of entire continents. They taught generations that inequality was not a social construct, but a geographic and climatic inevitability, proving that a map's most dangerous lie can be a line that claims to be scientific, not sacred. While the zonal maps used climate to justify global hierarchies and the Portoland charts used secrecy to control the seas, other cartographers turned their attention inward, focusing on the very heart of a kingdom to shape its identity from within. This brings us to a map that feels, at first glance, like a stunning leap forward in accuracy and reason: the Go map of Britain. Dating from around 1360, it is a revolutionary document, the earliest known map to show the island of Britain in a recognizable geographic form, with coastlines, rivers, and hundreds of towns plotted with a newfound concern for spatial relationships. It even features a sophisticated network of red lines connecting settlements, an early and brilliant representation of a road system. For centuries, it has been celebrated as a landmark of empirical cartography, a sign that the dark ages of mythical geography were finally giving way to the light of science. But to view it only through that lens is to miss its most ingenious and insidious function. The Go map is not just a picture of Britain. It is a powerful argument for what Britain should be: a unified kingdom dominated by England, with its Celtic neighbors visually diminished and subsumed. The deception is not one of blatant fantasy like the island of Brassal, but of subtle, calculated distortion. The map's creator, likely working under the patronage of the English crown or a powerful noble sympathetic to its aims, employed a clever cartographic trick known as perceptual scaling. He dramatically exaggerated the size and prominence of England, particularly the wealthy, populous southeast around London. This area is rendered in expansive detail, its towns densely packed, its roads numerous, creating a visual weight that pulls the viewer's eye and establishes it as the undeniable core of the island. In stark contrast, look to the north. Scotland is shrunk, compressed, and pushed awkwardly into a corner. Its shape is distorted, its coastline simplified into a crude, almost dismissive curve. It appears not as a separate, sovereign kingdom, which it was at the time, fighting fiercely to maintain its independence, but as a shrunken, remote appendage, an afterthought clinging to the edge of a greater England. The treatment of Wales is even more revealing. It is not just reduced in size, it is physically severed from England by a monstrously wide and exaggerated River Severn, which cuts across the map like a formidable moat. This was a brilliant piece of visual propaganda. By making this natural boundary seem so vast and impassable, the mapmaker was simultaneously defining Wales as a separate, isolated entity and implicitly suggesting that such a division was a problem to be solved. For an English king like Edward I or his successors, who had spent decades and vast resources trying to conquer Wales, this depiction was perfect. It showed their ultimate goal, to leap that cartographic moat and fully absorb that isolated, diminished land into the English whole. The map didn't just record a border, it drew a target. This manipulation was aimed at two distinct audiences. For a domestic audience, English barons, merchants, and clerics, the map was a tool for building a unified national identity. In an era of frequent rebellion and shifting allegiances, it presented a vision of a coherent, natural, and English-dominated Britain. It made the political ambition of a United Kingdom feel like a geographic inevitability. For an international audience, perhaps a visiting diplomat or a foreign trader, the map sent a clear message of power and control. It proclaimed that the King of England was the master of this entire island, that his authority was as solid and undeniable as the mountains and rivers depicted. It was a silent, potent piece of diplomatic pressure, designed to legitimize English claims and discourage foreign powers from offering support to Scottish or Welsh rebels. Beyond its borders, the Go map's inclusion of that detailed road network and specific resources like forests and lead mines reveals its other, more pragmatic purpose. Those red lines weren't just for pilgrims. They were military logistics routes, showing the fastest ways to move troops to quell an uprising in the north or reinforce a garrison in the west. The notation of resources indicated where wealth could be extracted to fund those very campaigns. It was, in essence, both a blueprint for administration and a battle plan for consolidation, all disguised as a simple map. The Go map proves that the most effective cartographic lies are often the quietest ones, not the addition of dragons, but the gentle push of a border, the slight shrinkage of a rival, turning a map into the opening argument for an empire. Yet even as kings redrew their borders and merchants chased phantom islands, another cartographic deception was flowing from the pens of monks and scholars, one that twisted the very geography of a continent to serve a quest for both divine revelation and earthly power. This was the myth of the Nile, a river that on medieval maps ceased to be a simple waterway and became a sprawling, impossible labyrinth leading straight to the gates of paradise itself. The Nile, more than any other geographic feature, became a canvas for the deepest yearnings of the medieval mind, a test of faith, a promise of untold wealth, and a riddle that would lure explorers to their deaths for centuries, all based on a beautiful, breathtaking lie. The origin of this deception lies not in the Middle Ages, but deep in the classical world. Ancient Greek and Roman geographers, from Herodotus to Ptolemy, were utterly fascinated by the Nile. They knew it was the lifeblood of Egypt, but its source remained a profound mystery. To explain the river's annual, life-giving flood, which seemed to happen without any rainfall, they spun elaborate theories. The most persistent and captivating was that the Nile's source lay in the mountains of the Moon, a majestic, snow-capped range somewhere in the depths of Africa, whose melting waters fed the great river. But for medieval Christian cartographers, this classical puzzle was not enough. They took this kernel of a mystery and grafted onto it a far more potent and compelling narrative from the Bible. In the book of Genesis, a river is described as flowing out of the Garden of Eden before parting into 4 great branches, one of which is named the Gihon and was traditionally associated with the Nile. This was the spark that set the cartographic world on fire. If the Gihon was the Nile, then by simply following the river upstream, one could theoretically journey back to the very cradle of creation, to the earthly paradise from which humanity had been exiled. This intoxicating idea transformed every map that featured the Nile. On the Hereford Mapa Mundi and countless others, the river is not depicted as a single waterway with a simple delta. Instead, it is shown as a massive, forking tree, its branches spreading wildly and impossibly across the entire width of Africa. These branches did not trace real tributaries, they traced a theological argument. They were drawn to connect directly to the depiction of paradise, usually shown as a walled garden at the very edge of the map in the east. The cartographers were not trying to be accurate. They were creating a visual pilgrimage route, a highway to heaven inked onto parchment. The river's course was no longer a matter of geography but of destiny, a liquid path back to grace and divine favor. For a culture steeped in the idea of life as a spiritual journey, this was the ultimate destination, and the map was the ultimate guidebook. The consequences of this cartographic fiction were not confined to monastery walls. They spilled out into the real world with tremendous force, driving exploration and shaping the destiny of nations. For centuries, the quest to find the source of the Nile became one of geography's holy grails, a mission imbued with both religious fervor and the promise of immense political prestige. A monarch who could fund the expedition that successfully navigated back to paradise would secure not only his soul's salvation, but also his dynasty's eternal glory. Explorers sent on these missions were not just sailors and scouts, they were latter-day knights on a sacred quest, armed with maps that promised a spiritual reward at the end of a physical journey. They braved disease, hostile kingdoms, and impenetrable jungles, guided by a certainty that their divinely inspired charts could not be wrong. This belief, however, led to countless tragedies and dead ends. The maps had sent them searching for a theological concept, not a geographical location. The real source of the Nile, eventually discovered to be Lake Victoria in the 19th century, was nothing like the descriptions. There were no golden gates, no angelic guardians, just water, land, and more water. The lie had driven them forward, expanding the edges of the known world through sheer, misguided determination. Every mile charted, every kingdom encountered, and every waterfall sketched by these hopeful explorers was a piece of data that slowly, painstakingly, corrected the original fantasy. The very expeditions that the mythical maps had inspired were the same forces that ultimately rendered them obsolete. This is the profound paradox at the heart of this deception. The cartographic lie of the Nile's divine origin was one of the most powerful engines of real geographic discovery the world has ever known. It proves that sometimes the most potent fuel for uncovering the truth is a beautiful, compelling, and utterly fictional story, carefully drawn on a map. But the medieval mind saw no such separation between the heavens and the earth. For scholars and rulers of this era, the cosmos was a single, interconnected mechanism, a grand celestial clock where the movements of the stars and planets directly dictated events on the ground below. This worldview found one of its most visually stunning and politically potent expressions in a unique and often overlooked category of map, the zodiac map. These were not charts for navigation or for saving souls, but intricate instruments of power, designed to advise kings and popes by weaving a complex web of connections between the constellations in the sky and the kingdoms of the world. They claimed to reveal a hidden astrological geography, a secret layer of influence where the fate of nations was written in the stars, waiting to be read by those with the knowledge and the authority to act. Imagine an illuminated manuscript, its pages glowing with gold leaf and rich, vibrant pigments. In the center sits a traditional TO map of the world, but encircling it like a majestic, star-studded frame are the 12 signs of the zodiac. This was a common presentation, but the true deception lay in the intricate lines drawn by the cartographer, connecting each astrological sign to a specific region on the earthly globe. This wasn't random decoration. It was a precise, pseudo-scientific system of correspondences. The Ram of Aries might be linked to the rolling hills of England, suggesting a people prone to initiative and perhaps stubbornness. The balanced scales of Libra could be firmly placed over Spain, implying a natural inclination toward justice and law, a flattering association for any monarch ruling there. But the most potent links were the ominous ones. The venomous scorpion might be mapped onto the deserts of North Africa or the volatile steppes of Central Asia, branding those lands and their people as inherently treacherous, dangerous, and ruled by a venomous nature. This system of astrological geography provided rulers with a seemingly irrefutable, divine mandate for their most consequential decisions. A king contemplating an invasion would not merely consult his generals and survey his treasury. His court astrologer would first consult the zodiac map. If the sign governing a rival kingdom was under a malefic planetary influence, like Saturn or Mars, it was seen as the perfect astrological moment to strike, a time when the very cosmos would align to ensure victory. Conversely, if a friendly nation's ruling sign was in a weakened state, it might be the perfect time to offer a diplomatic marriage or a treaty, propping up an ally when the stars suggested they were vulnerable. This turned the chaotic, bloody business of statecraft into a predictable science, a game where the board was the sky itself. It offered a powerful illusion of control, allowing a ruler to believe his ambitions were not merely his own, but were sanctioned and even guided by the divine mechanics of the universe. The genius of this deception was its elegant appeal to the medieval desire for cosmic harmony, the idea that everything in creation had its proper place and purpose in a grand, God-given order. By overlaying this astrological grid onto the political world, the mapmaker wasn't just predicting the future, he was prescribing it. He was visually arguing that the subjugation of a people ruled by a violent sign was not an act of aggression, but a restoration of celestial balance. It naturalized power dynamics, making them seem as inevitable and unchangeable as the turning of the seasons or the phases of the moon. A conquered territory wasn't stolen. It was simply realigning with its preordained astrological destiny under a ruler whose own star sign was more powerful or favorably positioned. This was the ultimate in strategic misdirection, using the awe-inspiring mystery of the heavens to justify the most terrestrial of human cravings: land, wealth, and dominion. It cloaked raw political ambition in the glittering, untouchable language of the stars, making the map not a guide to the world, but a script for its conquest. While the quest for the Nile source was driven by a desire to reach backward to a divine origin, another cartographic fantasy pulled the eyes of Europe relentlessly southward, promising not a return to paradise, but the discovery of an entirely new world of unimaginable scale and wealth. This was the legend of Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, a phantom continent that haunted the edges of maps for over 2 millennia, not out of ignorance, but out of a deep, almost obsessive need for the world to make perfect, beautiful, symmetrical sense. Its story is a testament to the power of an elegant theory to override messy reality, and how a philosophical concept, once inked onto parchment, can become a self-fulfilling prophecy that launches 1,000 ships. The seed of this colossal deception was not planted in the Middle Ages, but in the mind of an ancient Greek thinker centuries before the Common Era. Pythagoras, and later Aristotle, proposed a fundamental principle of cosmic balance. They believed that the universe was built on symmetry and order. To them, it seemed logically necessary that the great landmasses of the Northern Hemisphere must be counterbalanced by an equal amount of land in the South. Without this massive counterweight, they argued, the entire planet would be thrown off kilter, wobbling uncontrollably on its axis. This wasn't a geographic observation, it was a philosophical and mathematical imperative. The world had to be balanced to be stable. This elegant idea, known as the theory of continental symmetry, was a beautiful lie that would prove more durable than almost any truth. Medieval mapmakers, inheriting this classical wisdom through texts that were considered infallible, enthusiastically embraced this concept. They began to depict this hypothetical landmass as a vast, shadowy ring encircling the bottom of the world, often labeled Terra Australis Non, Dum Cognita, the southern land not yet known. On maps like the Oronce Fenei world map of 1531, it appears as a gigantic, bulbous continent, sometimes connected to the tip of South America and curving up toward Asia, effectively landlocking the Indian Ocean. Its size was staggering, often dwarfing all of Europe and Asia combined. Crucially, this land was not drawn as a barren wasteland. Following the logic of symmetry, if the northern lands were temperate and rich, then so too must be their southern counterpart. Cartographers and the scholars who advised them filled this blank space with promises of immense fertility, gold mines that dwarfed those of Peru, and intelligent civilizations waiting for contact. It was the ultimate geographic lottery ticket, a blank check written on the promise of philosophical perfection. The most influential proponent of this myth was the legendary 16th century cartographer Abraham Ortelius. In his groundbreaking world atlas Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, first published in 1570, Ortelius gave Terra Australis Incognita a position of absolute prominence. He depicted it as a massive, sprawling landmass, and in the accompanying text, he didn't present it as a mere possibility. He wrote about it as a certainty, a place whose existence was as undeniable as France or India, even though no European had ever seen its shores. His authority was so immense that this depiction became the standard for decades. For kings, merchants, and explorers looking at an Ortelius map, that southern continent wasn't a question mark, it was a destination, a fact waiting to be claimed. The map had, through sheer confidence and artistic flourish, willed an entire continent into being in the minds of a generation. This cartographic fiction had very real and incredibly costly consequences. It became the single greatest motivator for the great age of Pacific exploration. When Captain James Cook set sail on his first voyage in 1768, his secret admiralty instructions were overwhelmingly focused on one primary objective: to discover this great southern continent, claim its riches for Britain, and settle the ancient debate once and for all. His voyage, and those of other explorers like him, was among the most expensive scientific expeditions in history up to that point, funded entirely on the back of a 2,000-year-old Greek theory that had been endlessly perpetuated by generations of mapmakers. For years, Cook meticulously crisscrossed the vast emptiness of the South Pacific, charting New Zealand and the east coast of Australia, which at first he desperately hoped were peninsulas of the great southern land. But with every mile sailed, every longitude recorded, the truth became inescapable. There was no vast, fertile continent. There was only ocean and more ocean and a few scattered islands. The myth that had driven exploration for centuries was finally, definitively, and disappointingly put to rest. The legacy of Terra Australis Incognita is a profound paradox. It was one of the most persistent and grandest cartographic deceptions ever perpetrated, a continent-wide lie that consumed fortunes and lives in its pursuit. Yet, in driving explorers to scour the southern seas so thoroughly in search of a fantasy, these maps inadvertently led to the actual discovery and charting of the real lands that do exist there: Australia, New Zealand, and the islands of the Pacific. The lie created a self-correcting mechanism. The very voyages it inspired were what eventually proved it false. It stands as the ultimate example of how a beautiful idea, given enough authority and drawn with enough conviction on a map, can literally change the course of history, pushing humanity to explore the unknown not because it is there, but because we are so certain our beautiful, orderly, and completely fictional version of it must be. While the zonal maps of Europe used climate to justify prejudice, and the Portolan charts of the Mediterranean used secrecy to control trade, a different kind of cartographic revolution was unfolding in the vibrant, multicultural court of a Norman king on the island of Sicily. Here, the pursuit of knowledge wasn't about proving religious dogma or hiding trade winds. It was an act of statecraft, an ambitious project to synthesize the entire world's understanding into a single, definitive vision. The result was the Tabula Rogeriana, or the Book of Roger, a monumental work of geography and its accompanying world map, created by the brilliant Muslim scholar al-Idrisi for King Roger II of Sicily in the year 1154. Hailed as the most accurate and detailed world map of its era, it stands as a stunning achievement of Islamic science and cross-cultural collaboration. Yet, even in this masterpiece of empirical observation, we find that the most sophisticated map is never a mirror of the world, but a reflection of the worldview and the political needs of its patron. To understand the map's genius and its subtle deceptions, we must first step into the unique world that produced it. In the 12th century, the island of Sicily was a breathtaking anomaly, a place where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars worked side by side under the enlightened rule of the Norman kings. Roger II was a monarch obsessed with knowledge, and he assembled a dream team of the greatest thinkers, regardless of their faith, at his palace in Palermo. Into this intellectual paradise came Muhammad al-Idrisi, a well-traveled Muslim geographer from a noble family in North Africa. For 15 years, Roger funded al-Idrisi's work, providing him with immense resources and a mandate that was both scientific and political, to create the ultimate map of the known world. Al-Idrisi and his team didn't just sit in a library. They actively interviewed travelers, merchants, and diplomats who passed through Sicily's busy ports, cross-referencing their stories with classical Greek texts like the work of Ptolemy and the latest advances from the Islamic world. This was a truly global fact-finding mission, and the resulting map was a synthesis of knowledge unprecedented in its scope. The map itself, which was oriented with the south at the top in the tradition of many Islamic maps, was a thing of beauty and precision. It depicted the entire Eurasian continent and the northern part of Africa with a level of detail that would not be surpassed in Europe for another 3 centuries. The coastlines of the Mediterranean are remarkably accurate. The river systems of the Nile and the Tigris-Euphrates are carefully rendered, and the cities of the Islamic world from Cordoba and Cairo to Baghdad and Damascus are plotted with meticulous care. For anyone looking to understand the geography of the Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, the tabula Rogeriana was an unparalleled resource. It was, in many ways, the Google Earth of the medieval Muslim world, a testament to the power of collaborative, evidence-based inquiry. But this is where the brilliance of its selective truth emerges. While the Islamic world is rendered in exquisite, loving detail, other regions tell a different story. Look toward Europe, north of the Mediterranean. The shape becomes vague, almost schematic. The British Isles are shrunk and distorted, pushed awkwardly into the corner of the map. Scandinavia is a mere ghost, a barely suggested peninsula. The deeper you go into Christendom, the fuzzier the details become. The same is true for sub-Saharan Africa. While North Africa is meticulously charted, the continent south of the Sahara dissolves into a generic landmass, with the sources of the Nile reverting to classical legend rather than empirical observation. This wasn't a result of ignorance. Al-Idrisi had access to accounts from trans-Saharan traders. This was a deliberate act of cartographic emphasis. The map was engineered to create a specific cognitive reality. It presented a world where the center of gravity, the place of utmost importance and precision, was the Islamic Mediterranean and the lands of the East. Europe and deep Africa were the periphery, the margins, the less important elsewheres. This served King Roger's political vision perfectly. He ruled a kingdom that was a bridge between cultures, but his power and his primary trade interests were firmly anchored in the Mediterranean world. By creating a map that so vividly detailed his sphere of influence while downplaying the lands of his northern European rivals, Roger was making a powerful statement. His court in Palermo was not on the edge of Christendom. It was at the very center of the civilized world as he defined it. The map was a tool of soft power, proclaiming Sicily's role as the intellectual and commercial hub where East met West. The tabula Rogeriana is a vital reminder that cartographic bias is a universal language, spoken not just in Christian monasteries but in the most advanced and cosmopolitan courts of the world. It proves that selectivity is not a sign of primitive mapmaking, but an inherent feature of the craft itself. Even when armed with the best data, a mapmaker's hand is always guided by the priorities of the patron, the limits of their sources, and the unspoken desire to make the world conform to a specific, politically useful vision. Al-Idrisi didn't need to draw monsters on the edges of his map to deceive. He simply chose to shine the brightest light on the world that mattered most to the king who employed him, allowing other continents to recede into a strategically convenient shadow. But if the Ebstorf map used the body of Christ to define a world of sacred and monstrous, and the Portolan charts used selective accuracy to wage economic war, then another cartographic deception tapped into something even more primal and powerful: the deep-seated, end-of-days terror of a final, overwhelming invasion. This was the myth of Gog and Magog, and medieval mapmakers didn't just illustrate this biblical prophecy, they literally built it into the very geography of the world, transforming an apocalyptic nightmare into a concrete, mappable threat that shaped foreign policy and military strategy for centuries. This was perhaps the most potent fusion of faith and fear ever committed to parchment, a lie designed not just to describe the world, but to prepare for its fiery end. The origin of this story lies in the distant prophetic texts of the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Ezekiel, and later in the New Testament's book of Revelation. These scriptures spoke of Gog and Magog as savage, monstrous nations held in check by divine power until the end of time, when they would be unleashed upon the civilized world as an instrument of God's final judgment. They were the ultimate other, a faceless horde representing chaos, evil, and the existential enemies of God's people. For early Christian theologians, this was a powerful eschatological narrative, a story about how the world would end. But for medieval cartographers, it wasn't enough to leave this threat as a vague event in the future. They needed to give it a location, to pin this terrifying prophecy to a specific point on the map. By making it geographical, they made it real, manageable, and most importantly, actionable. This process of cartographic confinement began with one of history's most influential and unfortunate errors. The great 4th century BCE Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote of a people known as the Caspians, and in his works he mentioned that Alexander the Great had built a great wall in the Caucasus Mountains to keep out barbarian tribes from the north. Centuries later, Jewish and Christian scholars, searching for a way to visualize the Gog and Magog prophecy, seized upon this story. They conflated Aristotle's Caspians with the biblical nations, and Alexander's wall was reimagined not as a historical fortification, but as a divine instrument, the very barrier holding back the apocalyptic hordes until the appointed time. This creative misinterpretation provided the perfect pseudo-historical justification for what came next. On maps like the Hereford Mapa Mundi and the Ebstorf map, you can see the stunning result. In the far north of Asia, nestled among vaguely drawn mountains, a massive, impenetrable stone wall is clearly depicted, and just behind it, often shown crowded together like cattle in a pen, are the figures of the Gog and Magog tribes. They are never drawn as ordinary people. On the Hereford map, they are depicted as grotesque, wild-eyed cannibals, feasting on human limbs and the raw flesh of dogs. The Ebstorf map shows them as monstrous subhumans, their features distorted to emphasize their savagery and otherness. The accompanying labels are not subtle. They describe them as unclean nations and the tribes of Satan, explicitly linking them to the Antichrist and the end times. The mapmakers were not documenting a culture, they were drawing a personified embodiment of evil, and they were showing you exactly where it was being held. This act of cartographic imprisonment was a psychological and political masterstroke. By visually locking Gog and Magog behind a wall on the edge of the known world, the maps performed two crucial functions. First, they provided a satisfying explanation for why this apocalyptic invasion hadn't happened yet. The wall was holding for now. It offered a fragile sense of security, a belief that the terrifying prophecy was under control and its timing was in God's hands. But second, and more importantly, it created a tangible enemy. It wasn't a vague force of evil. It was a specific population located in a specific place, a place that, worryingly, was often drawn in regions corresponding to the steppes of Central Asia, the very homelands of the Mongol armies that were beginning to terrorize Europe in the 13th century. When the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan exploded onto the world stage, the effect on the European psyche was catastrophic. Here was a seemingly invincible army of unknown, ferocious warriors pouring out of the exact region where the maps had for centuries placed Gog and Magog. The correlation was instantaneous and terrifying. Preachers, kings, and scholars looked at their maps and believed they were witnessing the fulfillment of prophecy. The wall had been breached, the end times were truly beginning. This cartographic lie now directly informed military and diplomatic strategy. The fear of Gog and Magog justified a fortress mentality, encouraging the construction of stronger city walls and the funding of standing armies. It also provided the ultimate rationale for the Crusades. If the Mongols were indeed the armies of the Antichrist, then fighting them was not just a war for land, but a sacred battle for the very soul of creation. The genius of this deception was its circular, self-reinforcing logic. The maps had created the expectation of an invasion from the east, so when a real threat emerged from the east, it was immediately filtered through that cartographic lens. The real, complex political and cultural realities of the Mongol Empire were completely ignored in favor of the simplistic, terrifying biblical narrative provided by the maps. This is the ultimate power of cartographic propaganda. It doesn't just show you where things are, it tells you what they mean. By drawing Gog and Magog on the map, medieval scholars gave a face and a location to their deepest fears, and in doing so, they guaranteed that when a real face appeared in that location, it would be met not with curiosity or diplomacy, but with apocalyptic dread. Imagine setting off on the most important journey of your life, a months-long pilgrimage to a holy site, armed with a map you believed was a divine guide, only to discover it was carefully engineered to lead you and your life savings down a very specific and profitable path. This was the reality for countless medieval pilgrims, and the maps they carried were masterpieces of a different kind of deception. Unlike the grand world maps that lied about continents or the portolan charts that hid nautical secrets, these were instruments of targeted, economic manipulation, turning the deeply personal act of faith into a carefully choreographed revenue stream for the church and the towns along its sanctioned routes. The most famous of these spiritual journeys were the treks to Jerusalem, to Rome, and perhaps most famously, the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James, leading to the cathedral in Compostela in northwestern Spain, where the Apostle James was said to be buried. For the faithful, this was more than a trip. It was a transformative act of penance and devotion, a grueling physical trial undertaken for the sake of the soul. And into this vulnerable, pious mindset stepped the mapmakers, often monks or clerks working directly for the powerful monasteries that dotted the popular routes. Their maps, sometimes simple diagrams in guidebooks, were presented not as choices, but as divinely inspired itineraries, the one true path to salvation. But the true inspiration was far more earthly. The primary deception was a clever manipulation of distance and danger. A map might exaggerate the length of a potential alternate route by a day's travel or more, making it seem like a foolish and exhausting detour. More effectively, it would graphically emphasize the perils of these unsanctioned paths. A forest that was simply wooded on the real trail might be illustrated on the pilgrim's map as a dark, impenetrable tangle crawling with bandits and wolves. A gentle stream could be depicted as a raging, uncrossable torrent. These were not innocent illustrations. They were calculated psychological tools designed to instill fear and herd pilgrims like spiritual livestock back onto the safe, well-trodden, and highly monetized main road. And what awaited on that main road? A meticulously planned economy of faith. The route was punctuated by specific monasteries, churches, and towns that had paid for the privilege or held the political influence to be included on the official map. Here, pilgrims were required to stop. They needed to purchase food and supplies at inflated prices, pay for a bed in a monastic hostel, and most importantly, make offerings at specific shrines to see holy relics. These relics were the cornerstone of the entire enterprise. The maps themselves would often advertise these attractions, sometimes with outright fabrications. A guidebook might promise that a particular church along the route housed a vial of the Virgin Mary's tears or a splinter from the true cross, artifacts that would grant indulgences, reductions of time in purgatory, to those who venerated them. The spiritual appeal was irresistible, and the financial gains for the relic holders were enormous. The journey became a form of spiritual consumption, where the pilgrims' piety was measured by the coins they deposited at each stop. This system created a bizarre and highly competitive religious tourism industry. Towns that found themselves bypassed by the official map could face economic ruin, leading to desperate attempts to get back on the route. There are accounts of communities inventing their own miracles or even stealing relics from neighboring towns to attract pilgrims and the wealth they carried. The map was the ultimate arbiter of this success. To be left off was a death sentence. To be placed prominently upon it was a guarantee of prosperity. This practice reveals a breathtaking pragmatism at the heart of medieval spirituality. The same institution that offered solace for the soul was also a brilliantly organized multinational corporation, and its most effective marketing tools were the maps that guided the faithful, not just to heaven, but to its carefully controlled toll booths along the way. Yet, even as kings and popes used maps to chart souls and sailors used them to navigate secret routes, another form of cartographic deception was taking shape in the stormy waters of the North Atlantic, one born not from religious dogma or trade secrets, but from pure, unadulterated ambition. This is the story of Friesland, a phantom island that never was, but which managed to carve its name so deeply into the charts of Europe that it became a stubborn geographical fact, a ghost that refused to be exorcised for over 2 centuries. Its invention and persistence reveal a fascinating new dimension to medieval mapmaking, the use of pure fiction not just to inspire, but to lay legal claim to the open ocean itself, turning blank spaces on a map into a battleground for nascent empires. The seeds of this elaborate fiction were planted by 2 Venetian brothers, Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, in the late 14th century. They claimed to have sailed into the North Atlantic on a daring expedition, encountering a host of strange and wondrous lands. Their accounts, published much later by a descendant, were a sensational mix of half-truths and outright fantasy, but they contained a description that would prove irresistibly seductive to cartographers. A large, fertile island named Friesland, supposedly located south of Iceland. There was no factual basis for this island, but the Zeno narrative arrived at a perfect historical moment. Europe was on the cusp of the Age of Discovery, and every maritime power was desperate for any advantage, any claim that could give them a leg up in the frantic scramble for new territories. The Zeno map, with its confident depiction of Friesland, offered just that. For the kings and cartographers of England, France, and Portugal, Friesland was not a mistake, it was an opportunity. In an era where international law was often based on the principle of terra nullius, claiming land that was supposedly empty or unknown to others, a well-placed island on a respected map could serve as a powerful legal instrument. If a nation could prove through cartographic evidence that their explorers had already discovered and mapped a territory, they could assert sovereignty over it, effectively locking their rivals out. Friesland, placed strategically between Europe and the rumored riches of the New World, became a perfect candidate for this kind of claim staking. A cartographer in the pay of the English crown, for instance, could prominently feature Friesland on a new chart, subtly suggesting that English sailors had known of it for generations, and that therefore the surrounding waters and any lands beyond were rightfully theirs to explore and exploit. This cartographic lie also served a crucial military and economic function as a strategic buffer. The North Atlantic was a vital highway for fishing fleets, particularly those going to the cod-rich Grand Banks off Newfoundland. By inserting a large, fictional island into the middle of this nautical space, mapmakers could create the illusion of a more crowded, complex seascape. This served to confuse rival navigators, potentially protecting lucrative fishing grounds by making routes seem more treacherous or circuitous than they actually were. A Spanish captain consulting a map laden with phantom islands like Friesland might be deterred from sailing a more direct, profitable course, believing it to be blocked by non-existent landmasses. In this way, the lie acted as a form of passive-aggressive naval defense, a way to wage economic warfare with nothing more than ink and imagination. The most astonishing proof of Friesland's power was its ability to be discovered time and again by seasoned explorers. The renowned Genos navigator John Cabot, sailing under the English flag in 1497, confidently reported sighting the island during his voyage to North America. How could an experienced sailor like Cabot make such an error? The answer lies in the profound psychological power of the map. Cabot, like all navigators of his time, trusted his charts. They were the accumulated wisdom of centuries, and the presence of Friesland on multiple authoritative maps created an expectation so powerful that it shaped perception. When Cabot encountered fog banks, icebergs, or even the distant coast of Greenland or Labrador, his mind, preconditioned by the Zeno narrative, was primed to interpret the vague shapes through the lens of the expected. He saw Friesland because his maps told him it was there. This phenomenon, where a cartographic fiction creates its own confirming reality, shows that the most effective lies are those that tell people what they are already prepared to believe. For nearly 200 years, Friesland stubbornly clung to its place on the world's most influential maps, from those of Gerardus Mercator to Abraham Ortelius. Its slow, reluctant erasure was not a single event but a process of incremental correction, as countless ships sailed through its supposed location and found only empty, rolling waves. It was finally the detailed, scientific surveys of the British Admiralty in the 18th century that consigned Friesland to the history books for good. But its long and stubborn life on the charts stands as a perfect case study in how a simple line drawn on a map can reshape reality, driving exploration, justifying claims, and confusing rivals. It proves that in the hands of a skilled cartographer, a lie could be more useful than a truth, and a phantom island could become a nation's most valuable overseas territory. But if the phantom island of Friesland was a lie of pure invention and the pilgrim maps were a lie of economic exploitation, then the most pervasive and psychologically potent deception of all was one that required no monsters, no hidden coastlines, and no phantom land. It was a lie woven into the very iconography of the map itself, a symbolic language so subtle and so ingrained that it shaped the worldview of an entire continent for centuries. This was the gendering of geography, the practice of depicting the world not through lines and labels, but through the bodies of women, transforming the cold, hard calculus of conquest into a resonant narrative of masculine duty and feminine submission. This allegorical cartography didn't just record the world, it scripted a drama of domination, making the violence of empire feel like a natural, even chivalrous act. The most famous and influential examples of this practice bloomed during the Renaissance, building on medieval traditions but refining them for a new age of global ambition. Look at the title page of Abraham Ortelius's groundbreaking 1570 atlas Theatrum Orbis Terrarum. There, surrounding the titular globe, you don't find abstract shapes or simple names. You find 4 female figures, each embodying a continent. Europa is front and center, seated on a throne. She is regal, clothed in rich fabrics, her posture erect and commanding. She holds a scepter, and at her side are the tools of power and knowledge, a crown, books, scientific instruments. She is the personification of civilization itself, rational, ordered, and dominant. This is the mapmaker's first and most crucial argument. Europe is not just a place, it is the embodiment of enlightened authority. Now, observe the other figures. Asia sits nearby, also lavishly dressed, but her ornaments are exotic and strange. She holds a censer billowing incense, an allusion to the mysterious spices and perfumes of the East. She represents wealth, but it is a passive, sensual wealth, something to be acquired and consumed, not a reflection of inherent cultural achievement. Then there is Africa. She is semi-nude, her skin dark. She rests her hand on the head of a crocodile, and a scorpion might be seen at her feet. Her headdress is not a crown, but something wild, perhaps made of feathers. She is the embodiment of the untamed, the dangerous, the primal. She is nature in its rawest, most fearsome form, devoid of the civilizing influence that defines Europa. Finally, in later editions, America makes her appearance, a near-naked figure often depicted with a severed head, symbolizing the cannibalism Europeans associated with the New World. She is savage, unpredictable, and ripe for taming. This visual hierarchy was a masterpiece of ideological coding. By making Europe a powerful queen and the other continents various forms of exotic, primitive, or dangerous women, the mapmakers were telling a story that everyone, from an illiterate sailor to an educated king, could instantly understand. It tapped into deeply entrenched social and gender norms of the era. In the patriarchal society of early modern Europe, the ideal woman was passive, receptive, and in need of male guidance and protection. The land, by its very nature, is also passive and receptive. It is something that is explored, settled, cultivated, and owned. The allegory created a perfect, seamless parallel. The newly discovered lands were these feminine figures, beautiful, rich, but ultimately helpless and in need of mastery. This symbolic framework provided the ultimate moral and emotional justification for colonialism. A military invasion was no longer an act of brutal aggression against sovereign peoples. It was reconfigured as a masculine, civilizing mission. The European explorer, the conquistador, the colonial administrator, they were not plunderers, they were suitors, knights, and benevolent patriarchs. Their role was to woo the savage land, to defend her from her own wildness, to bring her into the orderly, rational family of nations presided over by Mother Europa. The violence of conquest was sanitized, transformed into a romantic adventure or a paternal duty. The exploitation of resources became not theft, but the natural harvesting of a fertile bride's dowry. This allegory made imperialism feel inevitable, righteous, and even glamorous. It turned a crime into a crusade and a land grab into a love story. The power of this cartographic lie lies in its insidious subtlety. A false coastline can be corrected by a ship's captain. A phantom island can be sailed through, but an idea, especially one so beautifully and repeatedly illustrated, sinks deep into the cultural subconscious. It shaped the way generations of Europeans saw themselves and the rest of the world. It wasn't just a decoration on a map, it was a cognitive filter that made the subjugation of entire continents seem like the natural order of the world, a divine drama where Europe was destined to play the leading man. This use of gender reminds us that the most dangerous deceptions on a map are never just about where a mountain is placed, but about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we have a right to rule. While kings used maps to claim phantom islands and popes used them to chart the path to paradise, a far more pragmatic and ruthless form of cartographic deception was unfolding in the hands of a different kind of power broker, the mining magnate. For these men and for the monarchs who were often their silent partners, a map was not a spiritual guide or a call to exploration. It was a ledger, a blueprint for wealth, and most importantly, a lock and key. Their greatest lie was not what they drew, but what they deliberately chose to leave out. In the deep forests of Germany's Harz Mountains and the rugged moors of Cornwall, the most valuable secrets weren't hidden behind walls of stone, but behind a far more impenetrable barrier, a blank space on a carefully curated map. The scale of the wealth at stake was almost unimaginable. The silver mines of the Rammelsberg mountain near Goslar in Germany were, for centuries, one of the largest and most productive sources of silver in all of Europe. This wasn't just a mine, it was the financial engine that funded the ambitions of the Holy Roman Emperors, a river of silver that minted the coins that paid armies and built cities. Similarly, the tin mines of Cornwall in England held a near mythical status. Tin was a critical component for making bronze, and control over its supply meant influence over everything from the production of weapons to everyday utensils. To possess such a resource was to hold a strategic chokehold on a continent's economy. With so much power concentrated in one place, the incentive to protect it became an obsession. This is where the mapmaker's art turned from documentation to active espionage. A monarch like the Holy Roman Emperor would commission a detailed survey of his mining regions. These maps were marvels of precision for their time, showing the intricate network of tunnels, the depth of shafts, the flow of water used for power and drainage, and the location of smelting works. They were essential administrative tools used to manage the complex operation and calculate the immense profits. But these maps were treated with a level of secrecy that would rival any modern classified document. They were never intended for public consumption. They were stored in locked chests, their knowledge shared only with a tiny, trusted circle of operators and officials. To let such a map fall into the hands of a rival prince or a competing merchant family would be an act of economic suicide, handing them the keys to the kingdom's vault. The public maps of these very same regions, however, tell a completely different story. If you were a merchant from a rival state or an aspiring prospector looking at a commercially available chart of the Harz Mountains, you would see a beautifully rendered landscape of forests, towns, and rivers. But the single most important feature of that landscape would be conspicuously, utterly absent. The Rammelsberg mine, a hive of industry employing thousands, would simply not exist. The area might be labeled vaguely as imperial forest or left entirely blank, a silent void where a mountain of silver should be. This was a lie of omission, a calculated act of erasure. The cartographer, under strict orders, was using his skill not to illuminate the world, but to create a blind spot, a geographic black hole that swallowed the truth whole. The motivation was pure, pragmatic monopoly. By keeping the precise location and scale of these operations off all public charts, the controlling powers could effectively strangle competition before it could even begin. A rival couldn't exploit a resource they didn't know existed, or if they knew of it in rumor, they couldn't find its exact location to launch their own mining operation. This control over information allowed the elite to manipulate markets on a continental scale. They could artificially constrict the supply of silver or tin by closing shafts, driving up prices and maximizing their profit, all while the outside world remained ignorant of the true capacity of the mines. It turned geography into a rigged game where only the house held the complete set of rules. This practice reveals a chilling evolution in the art of cartographic deceit. It required no fantastical beasts or invented continents. Its power lay in its cold, silent efficiency. Where other maps shouted lies to inspire fear or wonder, these maps whispered the truth only to a select few, speaking volumes through their silence. They prove that sometimes the most powerful way to shape the world is not to add a falsehood, but to remove a truth, leaving behind an empty space that becomes, in itself, the most potent and profitable lie ever told. Yet for all the pragmatic deceit of mining maps and the strategic fictions of phantom islands like Friesland, perhaps the most beautiful and poignant cartographic lie of all was one that promised not riches or strategic advantage, but something far more profound: redemption. This brings us to the enduring legend of St. Brendan's Island, a place that existed not in the geography of the Atlantic, but in the deepest spiritual longings of the medieval soul. Unlike the calculated inventions of statecraft, this was a deception born from faith, a heavenly vision drawn on parchment that would ultimately prove more powerful than any truth in driving men into the terrifying emptiness of the open ocean. The story begins not with a mapmaker, but with a text, the Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbotis, or the Voyage of St. Brendan the Abbot. Written around the year 800, this Irish tale recounts the incredible 7-year journey of St. Brendan and a crew of monks across the Atlantic in a simple leather-hulled curragh. Their quest was not for land or trade, but for the Terra Repromissionis Sanctorum, the promised land of the saints, an earthly paradise said to exist somewhere in the vast Western Ocean. The Navigatio is a masterpiece of spiritual adventure, filled with encounters with talking birds, giant crystals, and even a lonely Judas Iscariot sitting on a rock in the middle of the sea. At the journey's end, they find their paradise, a lush, fragrant island where the sun never sets and the plants bear fruit in miraculous abundance. It was a powerful, resonant myth that captured the imagination of a continent, offering a vision of a perfect world untouched by the sin and struggle of everyday life. For centuries, this remained a beloved story, a piece of spiritual literature. But as the age of discovery dawned, cartographers performed a crucial alchemical act. They took this narrative and translated it from the realm of metaphor into a physical location. With a stroke of the pen, St. Brendan's promised land ceased to be a spiritual destination and became a tangible dot on a map, a place with coordinates and a shape, often placed southwest of Ireland amidst a scattering of other real islands like the Canaries and the Azores. This was the genius of the deception. By inking it onto a chart, they gave the myth the undeniable authority of cartographic science. A sailor could now point to it, plot a course for it, and believe with every fiber of his being that it was out there, waiting. The map became a contract, a guarantee that the promise of the Navigatio was not just a parable, but a discoverable reality. This cartographic lie served a vital psychological purpose. It was an antidote to terror. The medieval Atlantic was not just unknown, it was the Mare Tenebrosum, the Sea of Darkness. It was a place of unimaginable scale, of legendary sea monsters, of storms that could swallow whole fleets, and of a fear so profound it could paralyze even the most courageous mariner. To ask men to sail into that void for mere profit or kingly ambition was one thing, but to give them a divine destination, a paradise ordained by God Himself, transformed the nature of the journey. It was no longer a voyage into darkness but a pilgrimage across water. The potential for drowning, starvation, or monster attacks became not meaningless risks, but potential martyrdoms, sacrifices on the path to salvation. The map, by showing the island, effectively drew a line between the sin-filled old world and the pristine new world, turning a terrifying leap into a holy mission. And because of this powerful motivation, the lie worked. It genuinely catalyzed exploration. While no one ever found the actual island of St. Brendan, the relentless search for it pushed sailors further and further into the Atlantic. They would sail for weeks, scanning the horizon for any sign of the blessed isle, and in doing so, they began to bump into very real landfalls. The most significant of these was likely the archipelago of the Azores. While officially discovered by the Portuguese in the 15th century, there are persistent and compelling theories that earlier expeditions, launched from ports with strong Irish monastic ties like Galway and Bristol, may have reached them or other Atlantic islands while in pursuit of St. Brendan's myth. These accidental discoveries were monumentally important. They provided crucial stepping stones and way stations that broke the psychological barrier of the ocean, proving that the sea was not an endless void but a space that could be crossed. Each real island found, while not the paradise they sought, chipped away at the fear of the unknown and built the confidence needed for the eventual voyages to the Americas. The fictional destination had created a very real pathway. The island's stubborn presence on maps, lasting well into the 18th century, even after the Atlantic had been thoroughly charted, is a testament to its unique power. It wasn't kept out of ignorance, but out of a kind of sentimental respect and a recognition of its role. For cartographers and explorers, it had become a symbolic tribute to the courage of those early sailors, a reminder that the drive of the human spirit, for meaning, for paradise, for something beyond the horizon, could be just as important as the drive for gold in unlocking the secrets of our world. St. Brendan's Island was the ultimate navigational star, a fixed point in the heavens of human hope that guided explorers through the darkness of their own fear, proving that sometimes the most important thing a map can provide is not a fact, but a reason to brave the unknown. So what is the ultimate lesson from these 22 maps? It's that a lie, drawn with enough confidence and distributed with enough authority, can become more powerful than any truth. For centuries, these deceptions weren't seen as flaws. They were the entire point. The map was not a passive record of the world but an active tool to build a better one, or at least a more profitable and controllable one, in the minds of its viewers. They prove that every map is an argument. It argues about what is important by what it places at the center. It argues about what is dangerous by what it populates with monsters. It argues about what is valuable by what it illuminates and what it leaves in the dark. The parchment was the canvas, and the cartographer, guided by his patron, was the artist painting a version of reality designed to elicit a very specific response: faith, fear, obedience, or ambition. This ancient art of strategic misdirection is far from a relic. We are now drowning in a digital ocean of modern maps, each one just as susceptible to manipulation. When a social media platform's algorithm creates an echo chamber, it is drawing a personalized Mapa Mundi for each user, placing their beliefs at the center and populating the edges with caricatured opponents. When a nation-state engages in a disinformation campaign, it is creating a portolan chart for its citizens, omitting crucial facts and subtly altering the cognitive coastline to guide opinion in a desired direction. The fantastical creatures on the edges of the medieval map have simply been replaced by modern myths and manufactured outrage, all designed to keep us within certain ideological boundaries and looking in a certain direction. The power to define the map has always been the power to define reality itself. This is why these 24 pieces of parchment are more than just historical curiosities. They are a masterclass in media literacy. They teach us to be cartographers of our own minds, to always ask the most vital question, cui bono, who benefits from this particular version of the world. When you look at any map, any chart, any infographic, or any news feed, train yourself to look for the silent hand of the patron. Who commissioned this view? What kingdoms are they trying to build or protect with it? What journey are they trying to inspire you to take? And what paradise are they promising you at the end of it? The goal is not to become a cynic, but to become a critical thinker, to understand that every representation of the world comes with a perspective, an agenda, and a price. Thank you for exploring this fascinating world of cartographic cunning with us. These 22 maps are a powerful reminder that the most dangerous borders are not the ones between countries, but the ones drawn in our own minds. We hope this journey inspires you to look at the maps in your own life, both the ancient ones hanging in museums and the modern ones flashing on your screens with a wiser, more questioning eye. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's hidden truths, feel free to share your own thoughts and discoveries in the comments below, and subscribe to stay with us for our next adventure into